Welcome to week 2, everyone. I want to start off this intro video orienting you to what is coming this next week, reflecting a little bit on what we've just done in week 1 by thanking you for the just warm discussion introductions that we had this past week. I appreciate the spirited quality of our conversation and just the charity, generosity with which you've engaged the material, one another. I really appreciate that. So thank you. I think it's set the tone for a really great uh, discussion, learning for the next 10 weeks. I'm coming to you here from a car because my house is very loud with 4 children all at home and 2 dogs. And I don't have a room that is an office in the house. I have been using the backyard, as you probably noticed in some of my video responses to you. And it's pouring rain today in Los Angeles, so no backyard office for today. That means I'm in my car. I know a lot of us are just dealing with all kinds of changes to our life. Some of us are on the front lines of public service these days, responding to the most immediate needs of people with this disease. Others of us, I think, are under really significant pressures because of losses at work, difficulties at home, and so I know that this is a really challenging time in some ways, without precedent, probably in a lot of our lives. In the midst of it, I think, as I said in the kind of welcome video to the whole class, it's a time of unveiling where the needs of our society, of our communities, are being laid bare. Many of them were already there, and the spread of a disease is bringing them to light in a way that perhaps they were not as visible before. And in times like this, I think it's especially crucial for us. I might say we're being called to be people who show compassion to others, are filled with love for our neighbors in the concrete ways that we treat one another, are committed to being truthful about what is being lost and what is being exposed, even if that is uncomfortable. Doing that in a way that is mindful of people's suffering, and an expression perhaps of what Paul is going to teach us later in this letter, that the work of the Spirit among us enables us to weep with those who weep, to grieve with those who grieve, and at the same time to be people that will not cave to hopelessness, especially in the way that we treat one another, but insist on the power of mercifulness, of solidarity in a time like ours. So I hope that you're finding our class not just to be, something that you can be busy with while stuck at home, but also an inspiration as we study scripture together and draw on the gifts of the Spirit through one another to respond to the moment that God has chosen us to live in as people bearing the name of Jesus and called to love God and one another in his name. I want to devote most of this video to a couple of key issues that have already begun to emerge in the first week and that are going to become increasingly important in this next week and beyond. The first one has to do with the political nature and dynamic of Paul's gospel and his teaching in Romans. And I want to give a word of caution about this. This has been something that is relatively new, I think, to some of us. It was emphasized by both Jacob Taubes and Neil Elliott in readings this past week. I have a lot of sympathy with those writers. And in some ways, the political kind of quality of Paul's gospel should be no surprise to us, even though it has become unfamiliar in the interpretation of Paul's language, because Paul is a Jew from a whole history of God's calling out his ancestors from forms of imperial life, whether it was the Chaldeans, whether it was oppression by the Egyptians. I was thinking of Abram being called from the Chaldeans at the beginning. Obviously, Habakkuk has been complaining to God about the dominance of latter-day Chaldeans and receives assurances that God will not give up on God's people and that God will make good on God's promises. We could add to this story that Jesus was executed by the Gentile imperial authority of the day, and Paul has been imprisoned as someone proclaiming this Jesus as Lord, because Jesus managed to become a rebel king in the eyes of Rome. That's how he was executed. And people proclaiming him as Lord and forming communities to serve him in the world has been treated as a threat to the imperial order. Anyway, all of this hopefully helps you see that, of course, there is a political, anti-imperial edge force to Paul's gospel. The caution, though, that I want to give is that I think that for all the importance of this and how new it might be for some of us, opposing the Roman Empire, I think, is not the point of Paul's letter to the Romans. It's not the most direct point of his gospel. Instead, the focus of Paul's teaching in Romans is on forming communities of people in Rome and beyond to treat one another in a certain way, to carry out their lives in relationship to one another and their neighbors with a certain quality that embodies the coming of God's kingdom, the power of the Spirit of resurrection. Of course, this offers resistance to the Roman Empire. That should not be minimized, but it offers resistance to the forces that animate not only the Roman Empire, but all of the Gentile empires that have preceded it, and analogous forms of imperial dominance since. And we need to keep in mind the sort of broader scope of those forces if we're to make sense of what Paul is teaching and how it is that resisting even the empire of Rome is not a matter of just rhetoric verbally, although it might include that. It's a matter of embodying a certain way of living together. That is how God's justice is manifest in the world. Body of people living in certain ways with each other. That is maybe especially important in our time where I feel like justice can sometimes be cheapened by being a matter of easy talk on social media rather than embodying something of substance with one another. And as we see in Romans, the forces that Paul's gospel addresses in the world, forces that oppose God's kingdom, are not only social political, economic, though they certainly are, they are also psychological. They address inner struggles that every person is dealing with that cannot be distinguished neatly from the social and political struggles that they address as well. They are of a piece. So, this is something that I think we've got to keep in mind. And in doing so, what I'm trying to encourage is to really track carefully with the development of the argument and to follow what Paul is saying as opposed to just kind of seizing upon certain overtones of it or whatever. There's actually a specific rhetorical pastoral purpose that Paul is carrying out with the words that he's writing and the way that he's writing them and the tone that he's writing them. And that's what we want to uh, be able to express in our interpretation. It's going to take seriously, I think, the political, anti imperial edge of Paul's gospel, but not mistake simply opposing Rome for the point of what Paul is teaching, even if it is involved in what Paul is teaching. Second main issue that I want to address is the audience of this letter. Audience. In chapter 1, verse 6, as part of Paul's greeting and introduction of himself, which is, of course, a kind of summary account of his gospel. Then again in verse 13 of chapter 1, explicitly later on in the letter in chapter 11, he identifies his audience as of Gentile background. Why is this important? Because conventionally, in the history of the interpretation of Romans, and for many of the habits of our own minds, Paul is thought to be arguing against Jews, to be speaking against typical Jewish tendencies or something like that in Romans. And that simply does not square, as I think the explicit words of the letter tell us, with the audience as Paul identifies it. That means that when Paul begins to speak in chapter 2 against certain ways of understanding the law, certain ways of understanding circumcision specifically, we should not attribute what he is opposing to general tendencies of Jews. We have to ask how it is that Paul is addressing something that is current among people of primarily Gentile background in the Roman communities that he's writing to, and how, of course, we might reflect these same tendencies ourselves. This segues into an article, the subject matter of an article that I really want to call your attention to and urge you to read carefully this week. The title of the article is "The Politics of Interpretation, the Rhetoric of Race and Ethnicity in Paul." It's co-authored by Denise Kimber-Buell and Caroline Johnson Hodge. And it's not necessarily an easy article to read, but it is really worth digesting carefully. First of all, it clarifies what I have just said, that to box what Paul is opposing as Jews or Jewishness is an enormous mistake. There are all kinds of ways in which what Paul is teaching is Jewish stuff. He's teaching people to follow the Jew Jesus. He's teaching them to fulfill the Jewish law of loving God and loving one another. He is teaching them how to serve the God of the Jews. The list goes on. There's all kinds of Judaizing, we might even say, that is happening as a part of how Paul is forming his audience. That's not to say that Paul has no issue with Jewish authorities in his day, or even people under certain Jewish influences in the communities in Rome. But it is to say that we can't sort of use this binary of Paul is teaching against Jews in order for people to be Christian instead, as a way of making sense of his argument. If that binary is governing our interpretation, I think it will be wrong. Now, part of the reason this is so important is that the tendency to interpret Paul and much of the rest of the Bible as sort of the corrective to what was wrong with the Jews is one of the main tenets historically of white supremacy, whether explicitly or implicitly. The dominant form of Christianity that has characterized the Western world and been the engine of colonialism by white people has traded systematically in the Jew as the foil, the Jew as the demonized other on the back of whom the Christian gospel is built. And it is time, long since time, for us to confront that systemic problem that is both intellectual and cultural. It's also political. So we've got to be careful about interpreting Paul's gospel, Paul's teaching in Romans, so that we are not simply building our interpretation of what he is teaching on the backs of Jews and misrepresenting Jews, by the way, in the process historically, who do not often fit the assumptions that people have made about them based on what they've drawn from Romans or other sources. One of the other things that this article that I want you to read carefully shows us that's related is that binary of Jew, Christian, or something has often been kind of mapped onto binary of sort of ethnocentrism versus something universal. So supposedly Paul is thought to be arguing against Jewish ethnocentrism in favor of something that is universal as Christian, available to all in a way that Jews supposedly wanted to hold back and keep only for themselves. I think that this interpretation of the letter is very common and very poor. And so I want to urge you against it and take seriously what this article calls our attention to, which is namely that the way that the gospel is expressed always involves the particulars of people's lives, which we might conceptualize in ethnic terms or cultural terms. There's never an expression of the gospel that is culturally innocent or ethnically innocent. There's all kinds of ethnic and cultural particulars that inform any expression of the gospel, including Paul's, including our interpretation of it. And the way that we sort of come at the interpretation of Paul as if we could choose between something that's ethnically particular and something alternatively that's universal has been one of the key ways that the dominant parts of society, again, this has been primarily white people in the Western world, have hidden their own ethnic and cultural particulars behind a smokescreen of supposed universality. And so we've got to confront that related tendency. And all of this is a matter of, again, taking Paul's audience seriously and trying to track with what the specific rhetorical purpose is of the argument that he's making at the stage that he's making it in Romans. And being wary of these overly generalized categories or binaries that keep us from actually doing that careful sort of tracking with the thread of the argument. Of course, Paul does have something to say about how the gospel of God about Jesus, the Messiah, is the hope for the entire world. But the way that it is a hope is not by moving from something that is ethnically particular to something that is ethnically innocent and universal. The gospel is all about embracing and shaping the particulars of everyone's life, of every community's life. And we will see how the argument of Romans is actually invested in precisely that concern, taking people seriously in terms of where they come from, how they have been shaped, being responsive to their needs, as opposed to forcing them to assimilate to something that might be supposedly God's gift to the world, but is in fact uh, assimilating to a dominant form of society that might be disintegrating for them, unresponsive to their history, the presence of God in their past and present. So, as we get towards the end of the letter, the way Paul teaches the dynamics of hospitality that the spirit of God's kingdom cultivates is about not being fixated on a certain code of what it takes to belong, or what it is that God calls us to do, or how God calls us to share food, possessions, but instead is invested in that uh, long-term sensitivity to who people are, to what their needs are, and being responsive to those. I hope this gives you a little bit of a guide, maybe whet your appetite a little bit for what's coming this week, and I look forward once again to some more rich discussion in both response forums. Hope you all have a great week and look forward to the conversation.